Hi, I'm Gail Sokol, and on today's show, we'll be discussing the gluten game, how to create and control gluten in baked goods.
Welcome to Baking Radio. Learn the art and science of baking with author, educator, and award-winning chef, Gail Sokol. Whether you've been baking your whole life or you're brand new to the world of baking and you're looking to build your confidence and learn new skills in the kitchen, you're in the right place. This is Baking Radio.
On today's show, we're going to be discussing gluten, how to create it and control it in baked goods. So let's begin by talking about flour. Flour comes from many types of grains, but the most important flour to a baker is flour from the wheat plant. The wheat plant contains proteins that are best suited to baked goods in general and especially yeast breads. Wheat flours in general are identified by how much protein they contain, and all wheat flours contain varying amounts of protein and starch. Bakers refer to a wheat flour with a large amount of protein as a hard or strong flour. And these flours tend to form more gluten and are best suited for chewier things like breads, pizza, bagels, and artisan breads. A wheat flour with more starch and less protein, they're referred to as softer or weaker flours. Baked goods made with these flours tend to be more tender. These type flours are best suited for baked goods like cakes, pies, biscuits, and other pastries. I have talked about and referred to gluten many times in my podcast shows and in my videos. So again, what is it exactly? Gluten is a protein network or matrix that is made up of two proteins in particular found only in wheat flours. These two proteins have a name, gliadin and glutenin. I always picture them as the wicked stepsisters. It just sounds like perfect names, right? When water is added to wheat flour, long elastic fibers form, and they create this porous structure full of spaces or holes. Gluten is necessary in all baked goods to give them strength and structure, so they don't collapse and fall. I mean, this is really important, right down to the most tender pie crust, to the chewiest pizza dough. We don't want them to collapse. The following plants contain gluten: wheat, barley, rye, and sometimes oats. And I say sometimes because if the oats are processed in the same facility as wheat, barley, or rye as they can become contaminated with gluten. But pure oats are gluten-free. So what's the big deal about gluten? Like, why is it so special, right? What's the deal? Gluten is actually essential to the leavening of all baked goods for a proper texture. Most baked goods contain some form of leavening agent, whether it be yeast, baking powder, baking soda. All these agents create carbon dioxide gas bubbles. Even water in the baked good can create steam, which is a gas, and it also leavens. And don't forget air bubbles. They are the natural ingredient that gets mixed in with any baked good that you make. It's vital that these gases get trapped within the batter of dough. That, my friends, is where the gluten comes in. The protein matrix of elastic fibers is where these gases become entrapped. And once in the oven, those gases expand and they push up and down and sideways on the batter or dough, whatever you're making, causing it to puff up and rise. Thus, you have leavening. And this is why gluten-free baking can be such a challenge. Creating this structure to ensure some sort of leavening is not easy without those gluten-forming proteins. So we just discussed what gluten is and where it comes from. But the challenge for a baker is how to control the beast. There are some baked goods that we welcome gluten formation, as in yeast breads, like those chewy pizza doughs we talked about, bagels, and other breads, French bread, Italian bread, boules, and ciabatta, just to name a few. And there are some baked goods that we wish to have just the right amount of gluten without the chew. We want our baked goods to have some structure, but we desire tenderness in certain things that we're eating, like pies, tarts, cookies, cakes. Here is where we need some power over the gluten so it doesn't get too big for its britches, so to speak. How do we accomplish this? Well, it's not hard. And you have probably been controlling this beast without even realizing what's happening. So here are my 6 best tips that I live by to control gluten. First, what flour are you using? Chances are that flour that you're using does come from the wheat plant, and it contains a certain amount of gluten-forming proteins. Depending on what you're making, choose an appropriate flour. Making a pizza, a bread flour would be most suitable because it has more protein than starch. Making a pie, a flour with more starch in it, like a pastry flour or even an all-purpose flour, would be best suited for that. Second, use a fat. There's nothing that controls gluten like adding a fat to your dough or batter. Think about it. Why do cakes have so much butter in them? Because the cake wants us to gain weight? I don't think so. It's to create a tender baked good. The fat actually coats gluten strands, and it won't let those suckers join together to create a strong gluten matrix. Third, control the amount of water you add. Remember, gluten cannot form without water. No water, no gluten. And most cake batters contain milk and not a great deal of water-based ingredients, although milk does contain some water. Fourth tip, add sugar. Sugar is a tenderizing agent. In the form of a crystal, sugar attaches itself to the gluten matrix and it interferes with its formation. Those nasty little crystals. Also, interesting fact about sugar, it's known as a hygroscopic substance. That means it loves to absorb moisture, like water, and it competes with the flour in the recipe for water, and it will interfere with any gluten formation. Remember, there's little gluten if the wheat flour doesn't have enough water. Fifth tip, keep mixing down to a minimum. So did you ever notice when you make a quick bread like pancakes or biscuits, the recipe will say, combine the ingredients just until blended. Do not overmix. That's because it's understood overmixing creates gluten. And my 6th tip, if the recipe suggests it, allow the dough or batter to rest. This is very relevant when making yeast doughs. Very often, you'll see a short time when the dough gets a short rest, especially before shaping it into whatever you're making. This short rest, or a little siesta like I like to call it, allows the gluten to relax and thereby making shaping that much easier. It really works. So now you have the lowdown on gluten and you can tame it. On the next show, we'll be talking about my biggest baking mistakes and how they made me a better baker. Thank you so much for listening. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, my YouTube channel, and my website, chefgailsokol.com.